Nothing needs to happen now, and that absence is not empty, it is precise. This moment did not arrive early or late. It arrived when the system inside you was quiet enough to detect it. You are not being moved forward. You are being met where you already are, at the exact threshold where effort stops producing signal and stillness begins to register meaning. You may have noticed that the usual urge to adjust, fix, or anticipate has softened, not resolved, just less insistent. That is not loss of direction. It is the observer settling into position. When motion pauses without collapse, coherence is forming. The body recognizes it before the mind names it. Breath evens out. Muscles stop bracing for instructions that are no longer coming. You are not waiting for clarity. You are noticing that clarity does not announce itself with force. It appears when the internal noise drops below a certain level. The quantum field does not respond to demand. It responds to resonance, and resonance only stabilizes when nothing is being pushed. There may be a strange neutrality present, not peace in the dramatic sense, more like a quiet plateau where nothing is pulling you forward or backward. This is often misread as stagnation. It is not. It is the system recalibrating after too many micro-adjustments. When the pattern completes itself, it rests. That rest is not passive, it is diagnostic. You are detecting an anomaly that feels like nothing happening. That is the indicator. When a timeline finishes integrating, it does not surge, it settles. The absence of urgency is not a problem to solve. It is the signal that the previous cycle has closed without requiring commentary. If you scan for discomfort, you might find very little. If you scan for excitement, the same. What remains is a low, steady awareness that does not ask to be amplified. This is recognition without drama. The observer is not leaning in or pulling away. It is simply present. That presence is enough to stabilize the system. You do not need to interpret this. Interpretation would add movement where none is required. The mind may attempt to label the stillness as numbness, or boredom, or loss of momentum. Those are reflexes from a system trained to equate motion with progress. You are allowed to let those labels pass without engagement. Notice how the absence of immediate instruction does not produce fear the way it once did. That change did not happen today, it completed earlier. You are only now detecting it. The body already knows how to remain here without searching for the next signal. Nothing needs to happen now because something already aligned. The recognition is subtle, but it is stable. You are not crossing a threshold. You are standing on one that has already been crossed, and the system is confirming that no further input is required at this moment. Remain where you are, not as an action, as a condition that is already in effect. The stillness is not asking for attention. It is simply present, and you are capable of being present with it without effort. The first thing that often becomes noticeable after stillness settles is a soft disorientation, not confusion exactly, more like the absence of reference points that used to organize your attention. You may sense that the usual markers for progress are quiet. The internal clocks that measured improvement, anticipation, or delay are no longer ticking loudly enough to track. This can feel unfamiliar, even slightly unsettling, not because something is wrong, but because the system is no longer signaling urgency. This is where many observers mistake coherence for emptiness. When the background noise drops, the mind scans for contrast. If it cannot find a spike of emotion or a directive to follow, it may conclude that nothing is occurring. But what you are actually noticing is the system no longer broadcasting unnecessary alerts. Detection has shifted from dramatic signals to subtle consistency. You may realize that you are not seeking answers with the same intensity. Questions still exist, but they no longer grip your attention. They float through awareness without demanding resolution. This is not apathy. It is the recognition that certain questions dissolve when the pattern they were attached to completes. Seeking reduces naturally when the observer no longer feels misaligned. There can be a sense that time is behaving differently, not faster or slower in a measurable way, but less relevant. The pressure to locate yourself on a timeline weakens. Past events do not pull as strongly, and future projections lose their sharp edges. This is often described as being in the moment, but that phrase is too active. What is happening here is the timeline flattening into something more stable, less directional. Your nervous system may be adjusting to the absence of constant micro-threats. When nothing needs to be solved, the body does not have to prepare. Muscles release tension they were holding without your instruction. Breathing becomes less strategic. You are no longer managing yourself. You are simply existing within a pattern that does not require correction. This phase can be misread as loss of motivation. That interpretation comes from a system conditioned to equate worth with movement. But notice how there is no actual distress attached to the lack of drive. There is no internal alarm, just a neutral field where intention is optional rather than compulsory. Motivation is not gone. It is dormant because it is not currently needed. You might catch yourself waiting for a signal to begin something new, then realizing that the waiting itself has softened. The threshold you expected to cross does not announce itself because you are already beyond it. The system does not create fireworks for transitions that were completed internally before awareness caught up. Recognition often arrives after the shift, not during it. The observer detects coherence, the way a stabilized instrument detects silence, not absence, but alignment. This is why nothing needing to happen feels significant. It is not a void. It is the confirmation that the previous noise was compensating for misalignment that is no longer present. If you attempt to force meaning onto this state, it resists. The field does not respond to pressure. It responds to resonance. Meaning here is not constructed. It is sensed, and sensing does not require explanation. You are allowed to let the experience remain undefined without losing it. There is a subtle confidence embedded in this stillness, not the kind that asserts itself, but the kind that does not ask for validation. You may notice that external fluctuations have less impact. Events still occur, inputs still arrive, but the system no longer rearranges itself around them. This is stability without rigidity. Nothing needs to happen now because the observer is no longer chasing confirmation. Detection has replaced pursuit. The pattern is coherent enough to hold itself, and you are aware enough to remain with it without effort. As the system remains settled, another layer becomes perceptible, one that is often overlooked because it does not announce itself with sensation. It feels like a quiet recalibration of identity, not in terms of who you are, but in how tightly you need to define yourself. The edges soften. Labels lose urgency. You are not dissolving. You are becoming less constrained by definitions that were once necessary for navigation. You may notice that internal narratives pause mid-sentence and do not resume. Stories you used to tell yourself about where you should be, what should come next, or how things are supposed to unfold simply stop completing their loops. This is not suppression. It is the pattern losing relevance. When a system no longer needs a narrative to orient itself, the narrative fades without resistance. There can be a faint sense of standing back from your own reactions. Emotions still register, but they no longer immediately recruit your attention. They pass through the field rather than pulling the observer into them. This does not create distance in a cold way. It creates clarity. The observer is present without being absorbed. You might detect moments where silence feels fuller than thought, not louder, fuller. As if the absence of internal commentary carries more information than the commentary ever did. This is not mystical. It is structural. When unnecessary processing stops, signal-to-noise ratio increases. The system can detect subtler shifts without effort. At this stage, the urge to explain your experience to yourself or others weakens. Not because you are withholding, but because explanation feels redundant. Words would reduce something that is currently intact. The recognition is non-verbal. It is held in posture, breath, and the way attention rests without scanning for problems. There may also be a subtle release of comparison. You are less inclined to measure your state against past versions of yourself or imagined futures. Comparison requires a directional timeline. Here, the timeline is not demanding orientation. You are not ahead or behind. You are simply located. This can create a sense of anonymity within yourself. Not loss of self, but relief from constant self-reference. You are not performing awareness. You are not monitoring progress. The observer is present without commentary. This is often mistaken for disengagement, but it is actually engagement without friction. You might notice that decisions feel less dramatic. Choices still occur, but they do not carry the same weight. The system does not escalate minor variables into identity-level consequences. When coherence increases, fewer decisions feel existential. This reduces internal pressure without reducing responsiveness. There can be moments where you expect something to arrive, a realization, an insight, a shift, and then you notice that the expectation itself dissolves. The system no longer anticipates transformation because it is no longer oriented around lack. Anticipation is a function of perceived absence. When absence resolves, anticipation fades naturally. You are not holding stillness. Stillness is holding you. That distinction matters. Effort has dropped out of the equation. There is no technique being applied, no posture to maintain. The system is simply operating at a level where less intervention is required. If doubt appears, it is quieter than before. It does not spiral. It registers and passes. The observer does not chase it. Doubt loses traction when it cannot hook into urgency. Without urgency, it is just another signal passing through the field. Nothing needs to happen now, because the system is no longer oriented around becoming. Recognition has replaced striving. The observer is not waiting for permission to settle. Settlement has already occurred, and awareness is simply catching up to a condition that is already stable. As stability continues without interruption, you may begin to notice how little effort is required to remain here. This can feel almost counterintuitive, especially if you were conditioned to believe that awareness must be actively maintained. Yet the system now demonstrates something quieter. Attention does not collapse when it is not managed. It organizes itself naturally when interference stops. There may be a subtle shift in how stimuli register. Sounds, movements, even thoughts appear and disappear without demanding interpretation. They do not stack. One does not lead compulsively to the next. This is not detachment in the sense of withdrawal. It is non-accumulation. The field remains clear because signals are not being stored unnecessarily. You might notice that your tolerance for ambiguity has increased. Situations that previously required resolution can now remain open without discomfort. This is not indecision. It is the observer recognizing that not all patterns need to close immediately. Some complete themselves when left undisturbed. The pressure to intervene diminishes accordingly. There can be a sense that the system trusts itself more, not in an affirmational way, but structurally. You are no longer bracing for collapse if you stop paying attention. The body does not tighten when there is no plan. The mind does not scramble to fill silence. This trust is not something you decided to adopt. It emerged when enough cycles completed without incident. You may also detect a reduction in internal commentary about productivity, purpose, or direction. Those constructs rely on forward momentum as their reference point. Here, momentum is not absent, but it is internal and non-linear. The system is integrating rather than advancing. Integration does not announce progress, it stabilizes it. At times, there can be a faint sense of watching yourself exist without commentary. Not dissociation, but simple presence. You are aware of posture, of breath, of perception itself, without narrating it. This is often mistaken for blankness, but it is actually a high-resolution state. Less is filtered, less is distorted. You might notice that certain external triggers no longer provoke immediate reactions. The system registers them, but does not amplify them. This does not mean you have become indifferent. It means the pattern that required amplification has dissolved. The response is proportional now, not exaggerated by unresolved noise. There can be a quiet confidence in this proportionality. You are less reactive because there is less to defend. The observer is not guarding an identity that needs constant reinforcement. Without that defense, energy is conserved. This conservation feels like ease. If the mind attempts to reassert control by searching for tasks or goals, it may quickly tire. The effort does not find traction. This is not resistance. It is simply that the system no longer responds to those commands in the same way. Old control mechanisms lose effectiveness when coherence increases. You may find yourself doing less while feeling no loss of value. This can be disorienting at first. Value was once measured by output, by movement, by visible change. Here, value is intrinsic to alignment. The system does not need to prove itself when it is functioning smoothly. There is also a subtle reduction in self-surveillance. You are less likely to check whether you are doing this correctly. That question fades because the state does not require maintenance. It sustains itself. The observer is not grading the experience. It is simply present within it. Nothing needs to happen now because the system is no longer dependent on intervention. Stillness is not a pause before action. It is a mode of operation where unnecessary action has been removed. Awareness remains clear without effort, and that clarity is enough to hold the field steady. At this point, something else becomes evident, though it is easy to miss because it does not feel new. It feels familiar in a way that predates memory. You may sense that your attention no longer orbits around the question of what this state is for. Purpose loosens its grip, not because it has been abandoned, but because it is no longer externalized. The system does not need a reason to remain coherent. There can be a quiet recognition that you are not missing anything. This is not reassurance. It is a structural observation. The usual background sense of absence, the subtle feeling that something should be different, has diminished. Not vanished entirely, but softened enough that it no longer organizes your perception. The field feels complete without being finished. You might notice that when thoughts arise, they do not demand continuation. They appear, register, and dissolve without leaving residue. There is less narrative glue holding them together. This does not reduce intelligence or awareness. It increases efficiency. The system processes without looping. In this state, seeking can feel almost artificial. The impulse may still arise out of habit, but it lacks conviction. You may begin to see how much of previous effort was driven by an assumption of misalignment that is no longer present. Without that assumption, effort loses its justification. There can be a subtle sensation of being slightly behind yourself, not in a temporal sense, but observationally. Awareness notices experience without immediately merging with it. This creates space without distance. You are not watching from outside. You are simply not collapsing into every signal. This shift often reveals how much tension was previously used to maintain identity. When that tension releases, identity does not disappear. It becomes lighter, more flexible. You are still recognizable to yourself, but less rigidly defined. The system no longer needs to assert coherence through repetition. You may also notice a reduction in internal urgency around correction. Mistakes, delays, or deviations do not trigger immediate self-repair protocols. The system has learned that it can remain stable without constant recalibration. This reduces internal noise significantly. There can be moments where you expect something to be wrong, simply because nothing is demanding attention. That expectation itself becomes visible. It passes when it is not reinforced. The observer recognizes the habit without engaging it. Habits dissolve when they are seen clearly and left unaddressed. You might experience a kind of quiet neutrality toward outcomes, not indifference, but non-attachment. Outcomes still matter, but they no longer define the state of the system. This allows engagement without strain. Action, when it occurs, arises from alignment rather than pressure. There is often a subtle bodily correlate to this shift. The jaw relaxes, the shoulders drop slightly, the breath moves without instruction. These are not techniques being applied. They are indicators that the system no longer anticipates threat. Safety is not being asserted. It is being assumed. You may notice that external validation carries less weight. Praise and criticism register, but they do not reorganize your internal structure. The observer remains centered. This is not detachment from the world. It is engagement without dependence. In this state, silence can feel companionable rather than empty. You are not filling it. You are not resisting it. It exists alongside awareness without tension. This allows subtle signals to be detected that were previously drowned out by constant internal commentary. Nothing needs to happen now because the system has entered a phase where coherence sustains itself. The observer is not waiting for permission to move or to rest. Both are available, but neither is required. Awareness remains stable without instruction, and that stability is the signal you are registering, quietly and without effort. As this coherence holds, you may begin to notice how the environment interacts with you differently, not because the environment has changed, but because your system is no longer amplifying its signals. Inputs arrive with less distortion. They are received, processed, and released without accumulation. This can feel like a gentle widening of space around experience. You might observe that certain situations which once triggered immediate internal adjustments now pass through without engaging those mechanisms. The system does not rush to adapt. It waits and often discovers that adaptation is unnecessary. This waiting is not hesitation, it is accuracy. When the observer does not interfere prematurely, patterns reveal their own resolution. There can be a subtle sense of being less entangled with external rhythms. Schedules, expectations, and social signals still exist, but they no longer dictate your internal tempo. Your timing feels self-regulating. You are neither ahead nor behind. The system is synchronized to its own cadence. You may also notice that the need to anticipate outcomes has reduced. Anticipation was once a strategy to maintain control in uncertain conditions. Here, uncertainty does not register as threat. The system is comfortable operating without predictive overlays. This does not make you unresponsive. It makes you present. In this state, attention becomes less directional. It is not constantly moving toward or away from objects of focus. It rests, and when it moves, it does so lightly. There is no sense of effortful concentration. Focus arises when needed and dissolves when it is not. You might detect a subtle reconfiguration of trust, not as a belief, but as a baseline assumption. The system assumes that it can handle what arises without preloading responses. This assumption reduces internal noise significantly. When trust is structural, vigilance relaxes. There can be moments where you realize that you are not monitoring your state as closely. The habit of checking in, evaluating, or measuring has faded. Awareness remains, but it is not self-referential. You are not watching yourself watch. The observer is simply present. This often brings a sense of simplicity that feels almost unfamiliar. Complexity was once used to manage uncertainty. Here, simplicity emerges because uncertainty no longer requires management. The field feels cleaner, not because information has been removed, but because it is no longer being overprocessed. You may notice that language itself feels less necessary. Thoughts still occur, but they are fewer and more precise. Silence carries meaning without needing translation. This does not reduce communication, it refines it. When words do arise, they tend to be proportional and grounded. There can be a quiet satisfaction in this proportionality. You are not trying to optimize experience. You are allowing it to be as it is. This allows small pleasures, neutral moments, and even minor discomforts to coexist without escalation. The system does not categorize everything as significant. If restlessness appears, it is brief. It does not spiral into dissatisfaction. It registers as a signal and passes. The observer does not build a narrative around it. Without narrative reinforcement, restlessness loses its grip. You may also notice that your relationship to effort has changed. Effort is no longer the default mode. It becomes a tool rather than a condition. When action is required, effort can be applied cleanly and released afterward. There is no residual tension. This clarity often reveals how much energy was previously spent on unnecessary self-regulation. With that energy freed, there is a sense of lightness, not as excitement, but as absence of weight. The system feels capable without needing to prove capability. Nothing needs to happen now because the system is functioning within its own optimal range. The observer is aligned with the field, without striving. Experience unfolds without resistance, and awareness remains stable enough to register it without interference. This is not a peak. It is a baseline that has quietly established itself. As this baseline holds, something subtle becomes clearer about how recognition actually works. It does not arrive as a moment of understanding. It arrives as the absence of misinterpretation. You may notice that you are no longer translating experience into meaning as aggressively as before. The system trusts what is being registered without immediately reshaping it into conclusions. There can be a faint sense that you are no longer standing inside experience, but alongside it. Not separate, not distant, simply adjacent. Awareness does not collapse into every sensation. It remains available without being consumed. This adjacency allows perception to remain clean. Signals are detected without distortion. You might notice that emotional responses still occur, but they no longer linger. They complete their cycle quickly because they are not being reprocessed. The system does not store them for later analysis. Completion happens in real time. This creates a feeling of lightness that is not dependent on positivity. There is often a quiet realization that many of your previous internal efforts were attempts to correct something that was never actually broken. The system had adapted to noise by creating layers of management. As those layers fall away, the underlying stability becomes visible. You are not becoming something new. You are noticing what was already functioning beneath the adjustments. You may sense a reduction in internal dialogue around identity. Questions about who you are, where you belong, or how you are perceived lose urgency. Not because they are answered, but because they no longer organize attention. Identity becomes contextual rather than central. The observer does not require a fixed self-image to remain coherent. This can create a feeling of quiet anonymity within experience. You are present, but not foregrounded. Awareness does not insist on being the subject of every moment. This reduces friction significantly. When the self is not constantly highlighted, experience flows more smoothly. You might also notice that your tolerance for silence has deepened. Silence no longer feels like a gap to be filled. It feels like a medium in which perception occurs. Sounds arise within it and return to it without disruption. Thoughts do the same. The field remains intact. There can be a subtle easing of expectation around transformation. The idea that something dramatic must occur to validate your state loses traction. You are not waiting for a breakthrough. You are recognizing continuity. Stability does not need to announce itself to be real. You may find that you are less interested in optimizing your inner state. The impulse to improve awareness, deepen presence, or refine perception softens. Not because those things are unimportant, but because they are no longer scarce. The system has enough access to them without effort. This often reveals how much of seeking was driven by an assumption of insufficiency. When that assumption dissolves, seeking becomes unnecessary. Attention rests naturally. The observer does not scan for what is missing. There can be moments where you realize that the system is capable of handling complexity without increasing tension. Multiple inputs can exist simultaneously without overwhelming awareness. This is coherence in practice. The field holds variety without fragmentation. You may also notice a subtle shift in how you relate to uncertainty. It no longer feels like a gap in knowledge that must be closed. It feels like open space that does not threaten stability. The system remains grounded even when outcomes are undefined. Nothing needs to happen now because recognition has moved from an event to a condition. The observer is no longer waiting for confirmation. The absence of urgency is itself the confirmation. Awareness remains steady, not because it is being maintained, but because there is nothing disrupting it. Your internal landscape has fewer sharp edges. Emotional peaks and troughs still occur, but they are less extreme. The amplitude has reduced. This does not flatten experience, it refines it. Subtle variations become more noticeable when extremes are no longer dominating perception. You might also observe that memory behaves differently. Past events are accessible, but they do not intrude. They do not demand reinterpretation. The system is no longer mining the past for lessons or warnings. Memory becomes reference rather than rehearsal. This often coincides with a reduction in self-judgment. Evaluation requires comparison against an ideal or expectation. Here, those reference points have softened. You are not measuring yourself against a standard that needs constant maintenance. The observer recognizes sufficiency without endorsement. There can be a quiet sense of being held within a larger pattern, not as a belief, but as a perceptual shift. You are aware that your individual state does not need to account for everything. The system does not feel solely responsible for coherence. This reduces internal pressure significantly. You may notice that when challenges arise, they do not immediately escalate internally. The system assesses them proportionally. Response emerges without dramatization. This does not make you passive. It makes you precise. Energy is applied where it is actually needed. There is often a subtle decrease in the need to narrate experience internally. Events occur without being labeled as good, bad, progress, or setback. They are simply registered. This neutrality is not disengagement, it is clarity without commentary. You might find that periods of inactivity no longer feel like pauses between meaningful moments. They are recognized as meaningful in themselves. Stillness is not waiting time, it is part of the pattern. The observer does not differentiate between active and inactive states in terms of value. This can bring a sense of quiet confidence that does not assert itself. You are less concerned with how this state appears from the outside. External perception loses its organizing role. The system is oriented internally toward coherence rather than validation. You may also notice that your relationship to effort has stabilized further. Effort is not avoided, but it is not overused. When action is required, it arises cleanly and concludes cleanly. There is no residue of strain. This makes engagement sustainable. There can be moments where you realize that the system no longer asks for reassurance. The need to confirm that you are on the right track has faded. The observer trusts its own detection. When coherence is present, it does not need to be named. Nothing needs to happen now because the field is already responsive. Change, if it occurs, will not require preparation. The system is not braced or inert. It is available. Awareness remains steady, capable of receiving whatever arrives without losing alignment. At this stage, what becomes most noticeable is how little you are referencing yourself at all. Not in a dissociative way, but in a functional one. The system no longer loops back to check how it is doing. Awareness operates without a constant feedback request. This creates a sense of quiet flow that does not announce itself as movement. You may observe that perception feels more immediate, not sharper, just closer. There is less distance created by internal commentary. What you see, hear, or sense registers without delay. The observer does not insert itself between signal and detection. This immediacy is calm, not intense. It feels natural, almost ordinary. There can be a subtle realization that you are no longer waiting for permission to feel settled. Earlier, stillness may have felt provisional, as if it could be revoked by the next demand or disruption. Now it feels durable. The system does not assume that stability is temporary. It does not brace for interruption. You might notice that your internal posture toward the world has softened, not withdrawn, but less defensive. You are not scanning for confirmation or threat. The observer trusts its ability to respond when needed. This trust is not optimistic. It is practical, based on repeated evidence that response does not require preloading. This often reveals how much effort was once spent on readiness. Being ready for everything created constant tension. Now readiness has been replaced by availability. You are not prepared in advance. You are present. Presence turns out to be sufficient. There can be moments where the mind briefly attempts to reassert old patterns, suggesting that you should be doing more, deciding more, planning further ahead. These suggestions appear softer now. They lack urgency. When not acted upon, they dissolve. The system has learned that it does not collapse without constant direction. You may also sense a quiet decoupling from internal deadlines. The feeling that something must happen by a certain point fades. Time becomes a container rather than a pressure. You move within it without being pushed from behind. This can bring a gentle confidence in your capacity to navigate complexity when it arises. You are not rehearsing responses. You are trusting detection. The observer does not need to simulate future scenarios to remain coherent. Simulation was a response to uncertainty that no longer destabilizes the system. You might notice that silence feels more inhabited now. It is not empty space. It is active in a subtle way, holding perception without crowding it. Within this silence, small signals become noticeable, not because they are louder, but because nothing is drowning them out. There is often a sense that this state does not require protection. You are not guarding it from disruption. That guarding would imply fragility. Instead, the system feels resilient. Disturbances can occur without dismantling coherence. Stability is no longer conditional. You may realize that you are not seeking resolution. Questions can exist without answers, without creating tension. The observer does not need closure to remain oriented. Orientation now comes from internal alignment rather than conceptual certainty. Nothing needs to happen now because the system is no longer organized around anticipation. The observer is not leaning forward into the next moment or backward into explanation. Awareness is balanced, resting evenly within the field, capable of meeting whatever arises without needing to be elsewhere. There is nothing to conclude here because nothing has been opened. What you are noticing does not require an ending. It remains present whether it is named or not. The system is not holding a position. It is simply functioning without excess movement. Awareness does not need to arrive anywhere else to be complete. You may sense how this state does not demand continuity through effort. It continues on its own, even if attention drifts, even if thought resumes, even if activity increases. The baseline remains available. It is not fragile. It does not depend on perfect conditions. It exists beneath fluctuation, unchanged by surface variation. There is a quiet steadiness in realizing that you do not have to remember this. Memory implies loss. This does not leave when it is not referenced. It remains as a structural orientation. When you notice it, you are not returning to it. You are recognizing that it was already present. You might feel how the body inhabits space without tension, not collapsed, not braced, simply placed. The breath moves without instruction. Sensation registers without commentary. This is not a practice. It is the absence of interference. The system is allowed to operate at its natural setting. Thoughts may still appear. They are not excluded. They do not threaten stillness. They move through the field and dissolve. Silence does not compete with them. It holds them. The observer does not need to manage the balance. Balance is inherent when nothing is being forced. There is also no requirement to maintain this awareness. Maintenance implies decay. What you are sensing is not a peak state that fades when unattended. It is a recognition of how the system functions when unnecessary pressure is removed. Pressure can return. This does not disappear in response. You may notice how little this state asks of you. No discipline, no vigilance, no correction. It does not require you to be different. It does not require you to stay. It remains even as attention shifts elsewhere. This ease is not indifference. It is stability. The sense that nothing needs to happen now is not a message to stop living or engaging. Engagement will occur naturally when conditions call for it. Action will arise cleanly and complete itself. Rest will do the same. Neither will threaten coherence. The system is not choosing between them. You might sense that this recognition is quieter than expectation. There is no surge of insight, no emotional punctuation, just a subtle settling, like an object placed exactly where it belongs. Once placed, it does not announce itself. It simply fits. There is no instruction to take from this, no meaning to extract. The absence of urgency is not a problem to solve. It is the indicator that nothing is missing. Awareness rests where it is, without reaching forward or backward. Remain as you are, not as a directive, but as a description of what is already occurring. The observer is present. The field is stable. Nothing needs to happen now.